So you decided that recently you want to get into photography as a hobbyist, but you don't know where to start. You're wondering, what kind of camera should I buy? What is the best camera I should buy? But unfortunately, there's not a one size fits all over here. We have some questions to answer, and we're gonna take you through 3 different steps to come to that conclusion in order to pick your very first camera. I've been in photography for about 20 years now as a hobbyist, and throughout the years I've noticed that I may have made some mistakes in picking up my equipment, some things I kind of regretted buying, and I'm going to share more about that with you in terms of what to look for as well as what to avoid. Just a really quick note about brands. Whenever you're talking to different groups of people about photography, the subject of brands will always come up because whenever you're buying an interchangeable lens camera, such as a mirrorless camera, you're buying into an ecosystem, and different people will have different opinions about different brands. Such as if you're looking to buy a car, you ask 5 different people, what kind of car should I buy? You're gonna get like 5 different answers. To me, the silly part comes in where people kind of hate on a certain brand just because. So really listen for the reason why people like or dislike a certain brand. Because for instance, if you're hiring a contractor to fix something at your house and they show up with Milwaukee tools instead of DeWalt, and your favorite brand is DeWalt, you're not going to fire them on the spot just because they have the wrong brand of tools. You're hiring someone at the end of the day to fix something with a relatively good quality set of tools and to get the job done in a timely manner. So the brand in this case doesn't really matter. The skills and having a high quality set of tools does. With that being said, let's jump into the 3 different steps that I mentioned that we're going to go through in order to pick out your very first camera. Step 1, defining the requirements. We're going to answer these 4 questions, starting with budget. Number 1, what is your budget? And in this case, this is probably the least favorite question for everyone because it is often the most restrictive question that will limit on how you're going to get started, right? As a hobbyist, it is often a little bit difficult to justify dumping a bunch of money into something that is not a business and you're not making money off of. But this is something fun that you're planning to do and you want to buy the correct equipment the very first time. So with the budget, very rough numbers, it's gonna be probably $1,000 to buy a bare bones minimum setup, but you're really better off with something around the $1,500 to $1,700. And I'll explain more of that in the later part of the video when it comes to the equipment. Number 2, what kind of photography are you planning to get into? Now this might seem like an obvious question, but the way we're gonna approach this is we're gonna be picking the lens first and then the camera body because, and I'll say this over and over again, the lens is what forms the image for the camera body and it is the most important part of a camera system. Now, ultimately, from that, you'll pick the rest of the stuff, but beginning with the lens, that's going to be number 1. And while you're picking your lenses, do consider if you really want to get into something very specialized, such as macro photography or something with a tilt shift lens, which we're not going to cover in this video. But do know that you have lots of options with lenses when it comes to an interchangeable lens camera system. Number 3, what is your skill level? Have you used other cameras before and you're familiar with the basics such as the exposure triangle? And if not, that's okay because there are lots of resources out there that are free and easy to learn where you can learn the fundamentals of photography before committing to something and then getting overwhelmed because you don't know how to use the equipment or you're not familiar with the terminology. And number 4, what are your long-term plans for your photography? For example, if you know you want to start with an APS-C camera body, but eventually work your way up to a full-frame body, for your lens selections, maybe you go with a full-frame lens to start off with, and then when you have the money to buy a full-frame body, that will go nicely with the lens instead of needing to buy a new replacement lens because you switch to a different format body. This is where the concept of buy once, cry once comes in, and you do want to really plan this ahead of time just so that you can avoid rebuying things unnecessarily. Another thing I'd say is when you're buying your first zoom lens, don't just go for the lowest cost zoom lens because oftentimes if you're buying a kit lens where you have the 3x zoom, that may have good quality, but it may not have enough range for you to work with. For example, when I was buying my Nikon D50, which is that top camera on the shelf over there, I bought the 28-70 kit lens and I quickly found out that the zoom range wasn't enough for me. I ended up going with the Nikon 18-200 zoom lens with that and really liked it compared to the kit lens, even though it does cost a lot more. Whereas if I were to buy that that right away, I didn't have to buy the kit lens and then buy the bigger zoom lens after that to replace the kit lens. Number 2, general tips on what to look for and what to avoid. For your first camera, you want to look for a camera that gives you ultimate control of your shot. So for example, the P, A, S, and M modes are very important to have on your camera dial because it allows you to have varying levels of customizations for your shots. You can plug in certain settings and let the camera control other settings, or you can have full manual control over your camera should you want to go down that route. You also want a camera that allows you to change out your lenses, hence the interchangeable lens cameras that I was talking about, and this includes the mirrorless cameras. Now with mirrorless cameras, you can have the manual controls, which is pretty much standard across the board. You can also change out your lenses to things that are more specialized whenever you need them. And then also, if you needed something that's a more general purpose lens, well, of course, that's also an option as well. You also want to look for a camera that has a viewfinder, and this is important because this allows you not only to compose shots in bright environments such as a sunny day, that's the go-to example that a lot of people will talk about, but also it's useful in dark venues such as a concert. So for example, if you're in a concert and you want to avoid disruption to other people around you because you're taking pictures and you don't want a large LCD screen lighting up the whole area, you can not only use the viewfinder to compose your shots, but you can also use it for playback as well. So if you're previewing your images during the concert really quick, you don't have to turn on your rear LCD screen. Instead, it'll show up in your viewfinder. Let's talk about lenses. I generally go for something that's a little bit easier to use, so a larger zoom lens. There are different types of zoom lenses, the ones that are constant aperture. So for example, you see an f2.8 aperture all the way through. You don't see any other f-stops in the lens spec, in the lens name. Those are the ones that are more expensive. So for example, the 24-70 f2.8 lens, those are the ones that have a constant f2.8 aperture across the board. Even if you zoom in as much as possible, you're gonna still get that f2.8 lens. To contrast that, you also have variable aperture zoom lenses, whereas you have an f3.5 to 5.6, for example, meaning that on the widest end of the lens, you have f3.5, but when you zoom in, your lens loses its light collecting ability and then eventually goes out to something like f5.6 or 6.3, whatever the spec says. Generally, you'll find that the variable aperture zoom lenses will be a little bit cheaper compared to its equivalent counterparts, but I wouldn't let this deter you because even though it is important to let a lot of light in, if the cost of entry is so high that you're not comfortable doing this and you're really pushing your budget, it might not be worth looking at that just to start out. You also don't want to just get a prime lens to start because that makes things a little bit more difficult, especially if you haven't had experience with interchangeable lens cameras. The prime lenses, although it is great for collecting a lot of light, it is specific to a single focal length, hence a prime lens versus a zoom lens. So you don't want to make things too difficult when you're starting out. So that's why I tell people to look at a zoom lens first. Let's talk about lens protection. I'm a big proponent of buying a UV filter to protect your lens because having a UV filter will add a layer of protection against fingerprints and impact. For example, if you bang your camera against the side of the table or into the corner of the table, your lens could be in the way and the front element could be impacted. Well, if you have a UV filter that would absorb most of the impact, hopefully all the impact, and then you can just replace your UV filter instead of needing to repair the lens, which can cost hundreds of dollars depending on the damage. The UV filter isn't bulletproof, of course, but it gives you the option of having a small amount of protection for a relatively low cost. Some people, on the other hand, don't believe in using UV filters because they believe that it will degrade the image quality. Every single element that you put in front of your lens can degrade the image quality depending on your UV filter, but personally, I find that buying a multi-coated UV filter helps cut down on some of the risk of putting something that's inferior in front of your lens, and the multi-coating itself can also cut down on any flaring that can be caused by light bouncing around between the elements. Also, no one has ever come up to me and complained saying that, oh, your pictures aren't clear because of that UV filter. You have lots of options out there, and it is very easy to get into an analysis paralysis situation where you just kind of get gridlocked and not know what to do just because you have so much information coming at you at once. A lot of people will be talking about camera specs such as burst rates, how easy it is to focus with AI, stuff like that, and I say as a beginner, avoid looking into those kind of subjects and look more towards the basics that we talked about, right? Having the interchangeable lenses, having the ability to manually control your camera, and then also having that viewfinder allows you to have a very good starting point. You also don't want to focus on too many accessories because there are endless things you can buy for your camera, but stuff like tripods, external lighting, microphones, stuff like that, I'd say worry about that later because ultimately this is a modular system. You can always add on things later as you get more comfortable. You don't want to buy too much in the beginning, get overwhelmed, and then kind of shut down just because you have too many options going on there for you to take in all at once. Also, if you're just beginning photography, I would avoid looking into the raw processing workflow as well as specialized image processing software because you really want to master your technique with the camera first and worry about the raw image workflow as well as special processing software later on. Step number 3, do some comparisons on the camera specs and then go ahead and purchase your very first camera. Now this is going to be a very exciting part of the process because now the thing that you've been researching will now be a tangible object that is in your hands. Again, there's a lot to consider, but you don't want to get into an analysis paralysis mode and you want to eventually get that camera in your hands and go shoot. Because ultimately, you can read all you want, but until you actually use the camera, that's when you get your experience and get more comfortable using the camera that you have. I'm going to lay out some example budgets and what you can get as of January of 2025. This, of course, will change as the years go by, but this will give you kind of an example setup per budget. And in terms of what makes sense versus what doesn't make sense, ultimately, that's up to you for what you need. All right, let's talk about some examples here and what you can get per budget. Starting with budget number 1, under $500. This is a really tricky point because in my opinion, you're probably better off saving up and buying a mirrorless camera down the road. It might be very tempting to buy an advanced point and shoot that gives you manual controls, but it doesn't allow you to change out lenses. And this is a problem because it doesn't allow you to fully customize your shots because you're stuck with the lens that they give you. Even if they give you something like a 20 times optical zoom lens, that's not going to be the best quality lens for every scenario. You're going to buy it and then you're going to quickly realize the limitations and want to upgrade soon after that. Also, here in 2025, I'd say steer clear of DSLRs because they are an aging camera systems. They were really popular in the 2000s as well as the 2010s, but in the mid-2010s, the mirrorless cameras really took off and have heavily evolved to the point where it just makes sense to go with a mirrorless camera system if you're just starting out. If you're buying into a DSLR system, while the camera bodies can be found for pretty cheap, you still have to buy the lenses, which still cost a significant amount of money. And while you can buy adapters for mirrorless cameras should you upgrade from a DSLR to a mirrorless cameras, those adapters themselves can have some unexpected limitations, so that's another thing to watch out for. Budget number 2, $1,000. This will probably get you the bare minimum if you don't have any photography equipment at all, and this is what I'm assuming. You could buy some used gear here for some savings, and if you buy something that is in excellent condition, it's generally pretty safe. I'll start with an example here with Sony because I'm more familiar with the system since I own it. And again, a mirrorless camera with a viewfinder and manual mode is what you want. There is the Sony ZV-E10 that could be tempting, but that has no viewfinder. Originally, I was thinking of the Sony a6100 for the camera body, which was released in 2019, but the budget and the price of the a6100 even used limits you for your lens selections. In this example, we have a used kit lens, which is the 16 to 50mm, and that's kind of limited in the zoom range in my opinion. Instead of the a6100, you could go for the older a6300, which was released in 2016. This opens up the budget for a longer range zoom lens, such as the Sony 18 to 135. That way, you have a better zoom range to work with right off the bat. I would also recommend buying a camera bag to hold your equipment, but of course, that is an additional cost. If you want to look at new equipment, Canon does have some lower cost mirrorless cameras. I've never owned any Canon cameras, so talk to some friends about it. Try it at the store. That's probably the most important thing, right? Getting your hands on the camera at the store to see how you like the user interface, where the buttons are laid out, how heavy it is, stuff that you can't really pick out just from reading specs. I do see that Canon has an R100 that can be bought for $479. As I said, you want probably a longer zoom lens, so Canon does have the 18 to 150mm IS lens for $499. And then if you throw in a memory card, that will bring you to a total of about $1,000. But again, you don't have a camera case with that or any room for any other accessories. You'll probably want a UV filter to protect your lens, and also lens cleaning supplies so that you can clean off any fingerprints if you should accidentally touch your lens. Budget number 3, $1,400 to $2,000. In my opinion, this is probably where the sweet spot is for a good starter setup camera system. If you're into Canon, Canon does have the R50, and people seem to really like the R50 compared to the R100, but again, try these out and see what you like. As I said, I like a larger zoom lens, so let's look at the Canon 18-150 again. Let's add the Hoya UV filter for the lens protection. I've personally used Hoya in the past and never had any issues with them, and they do make great multi-coated UV filters for a relatively low price. Throw in a camera bag or a backpack, an extra battery, a lens cleaning solution, and that brings the price to just above $1,300. You do have a little bit extra budget in this case for a second lens that you can either buy now or wait until later. Canon doesn't offer any first-party RFS prime lenses. If you want to get one, you can look at a third-party lens manufacturer like Sigma. Last month, Sigma released the 30mm f1.4 for the RFS mount. It's priced at $369, and with the UV filter for protection, that brings the new total to just over $1,700 with this full setup. For general photography, I really like having a larger zoom lens being paired up with a prime lens so that you have the zoom range covered and you have a lens that is more specific to lower light photography or photography requiring more shallow depth of field. Many will recommend a 50mm lens, but for indoors, I find that 50mm is just a little bit too tight on an APS-C body, which means that I have to step back a little bit more than I'm comfortable with for the physical space that's available. Going back to Sony as another example, if you were to buy the a6100 new, which you can as of January of 2025, that goes for $748. Pair that up with a Sony 18-135 OSS lens. Add in the Hoya filter and some other camera accessories, and that brings us to slightly over $1,500. And just like the Canon setup, once you get familiar with your camera and you want to expand on your lens setup, you could go with that same Sigma 30mm f1.4 DCD and for the E-mount system for $364. That, with the UV filter for protection, brings the new total up to just over $1,900. And as you can see, Sony has a higher price point than Canon when comparing these two examples, and Canon also gives you a more modern camera for a lower price point, which is interesting. But if you look at the total lens selections for the E-mount system, not only from Sony, but Sigma, Viltrox, Tamron, Tokina, there's more to choose from than the Canon RF mount lenses. And this doesn't mean that Canon doesn't make good lenses. They do make some pretty awesome lenses if you look at some of the specs that are out there, which is pretty wild. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, so you have to do a little bit of research here to compare the pros and cons and take that into consideration. And finally, budget number 4, when you have over $2,000 for your first camera. This is the ultimate setup for the new photographer, but even though you have deeper pockets here, make sure you don't buy too much and get overwhelmed with the equipment that you've purchased. Going back to the Sony example, this opens up options such as the Sony a6700, which is the top-of-the-line APS-C camera from Sony. Throw in the higher-end accessories with the higher-end memory card, better backpack or camera bag, have an extra battery, and the lens cleaning supplies. And with Sony, especially with the newer cameras, they have revamped menu systems that would make things more intuitive. In their older cameras, for example, my Sony a7 III, a lot of people complain about their menu system not being intuitive, but Sony has taken back the customer feedback and made their menus better in their later cameras. As you can see here, you can spend $3,000 without even touching a full-frame camera. Speaking of full-frame sensors, take a look at the Sony a7 IV. This is super popular and a lot of people really like this camera. I do have the Sony a7 III personally, and on the Sony a7 IV, they do have the revamped menu system, which is much better. Pair that camera body up with a zoom lens, and in this case, this will be different than the previous examples because now we're going to look at the full frame zoom lenses. I'd say go with either the 24 to 105 f4, which is the one I personally own. I like it a lot, but it does cap out at f4. It is a constant aperture zoom lens, which is very nice. Or if you find yourself needing to shoot in lower light, take a look at the 24 to 70 f2.8 G Master Mark II from Sony. This was highly rated by a lot of photographers. And eventually, you want to add a second lens into the mix, so you can go with a 35 1.4 G Master, or you can go with something more elaborate. For example, if you want to shoot some sports or portraits, the Mark II of the 70 to 200 f2.8 is also very popular, that recently came out. The possibilities are almost endless here, and also don't forget about the other camera brands, because this video is going to be 10 times longer if I include all the other examples, right? You have Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm. Again, try out your friend's camera, try them out at the camera store, get a good feel before you commit to a system. So what do you think? Are you excited? Are you nervous? Are you sticker shocked? Or maybe a mix of all three? Well, the reason why I have the budget the way it is, and although it does seem high, I'm really trying to get a quality lens in your hands first and then build around that, picking the body, picking the SD cards. Those are less important. As a matter of fact, with your camera body, that's going to last you maybe several years, and then that's going to be out. And then your lens is going to go from body to body, and you're going to keep that for an even longer period. And that's why it is so important to have the right lens with you versus having a more expensive camera body that may seem to do a little bit more at first, and then having a poor quality lens, and then the lens being the bottleneck of your photography, and it gets very frustrating if you run into that problem. And that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you in the next video.